When we saw that the profile completeness actually had a very high correlation, it to us signaled you got a customer that's kind of like half in the boat, half in the water. Okay, you did the basics, but that's not going to make you look great publicly to the 50,000 brands that are looking at your specific software right now. You need to go deeper. You need to upload demo videos. You need to upload white papers. You need to change your call to action to, make it more accessible for folks that want to engage with your brand, right? You give a standard download link, create demos and stuff of that nature. And then that level of engagement meant they were really clicking on all ways to build their brand, drive consideration, and ultimately get opportunities for their sales organization.
Welcome to the Product Tea with Leah. I am your host, Leah Dara, and we are about to spill the tea with the best from tech about product growth and senior leadership topics. Welcome to the Product Tea Show, where we dive into the high-stakes world of revenue growth with a cold brew titan in global sales leadership. From revolutionizing tech sales at LinkedIn to driving G2 to unicorn status with a monumental 157 million Series D funding, he has more than doubled customer bases and ARR wherever he was helming. Recognized as one of the top 40 CROs to watch and a top 100 global sales leader, his insights and strategies have profoundly shaped the tech sales landscape. He's not just a revenue genius, he's a thought leader and advisor who's always on the edge of innovation. Offstage, he treasures time with his family and explores new cultures, enriching his leadership and life perspectives. Get ready for a burst of inspiration from a leader who creates trends, Mike Weir. How are you doing, Mike?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for that amazing introduction.
This was so easy. I had this ready for hours, as you know. There was no struggle getting to this point at all.
Yeah, I like the personalization, throwing in the reference to cold brew. I am a huge cold brew fan. Can't be convinced that it's not the best one out there.
Yeah, and as an ignorant European, I did not know what a cold brew is. Apparently, it's just cold coffee.
Yeah, well, it's brewed differently, so there is a lot more to it. However, you give me a good European espresso, and I am equally as happy.
Okay, that's really cool. So in the background, for those who are not watching the video stream of this, there is a Star Wars picture, which I really, really appreciate. And we're going to talk for 2 hours now about Andor, the new series. No, we're not. Okay, Mike, I just have one question to you. Can you introduce yourself to the audience in 1 or 2 sentences before we launch into this conversation?
I don't know if I have to add any more to the amazing introduction, but if you want to know more about me, I am a revenue leader and a former marketing leader as well. So I come to the world of go-to-market with a little bit of a different perspective, having lived on both sides of the go-to-market fence. And I'm excited to have the conversation today because I think product is the new coolest asset in go-to-market today.
Absolutely correct. I also want to emphasize that you changed the fronts. You went from one enemy camp to the next one. So from marketing to sales. So this is good. But before we go into this and also talk about what do people get wrong about you once they get to know you?
Yeah, it's funny. There's an inflection point in this answer. In a work environment, I think people get wrong that I'm just always business. I have a poker face when I'm doing business meetings. People that know me really well know that that's not me, that I have a personality, that I have energy. I want to go out and have a drink after work with folks or meet up for, coffee and breakfast. But I tend to be super focused, and sometimes, my wife worked at the same company as me a long, long time ago. She reminded me that I kind of came across as a jerk at work. I was just showing up to meeting, get stuff done, move on.
Is that something that you picked up as a CRO or as a CMO?
That was on the marketing side.
Interesting.
So maybe an insight and challenge from my wife helped me better transition into sales, where I had to be more personable and less standoffish with my kind of facial expressions.
Yeah. Okay. So nice to the customers, unfriendly and focused inward, right? That's what they say. Okay. No. But no. Mike is actually quite cool to hang out with. I like that you said that you have a character as well. So Mike, is there anything that you are afraid of or particularly excited about in the industry right now?
Yeah, I think, obviously everybody talks about AI and you have to. One of my biggest fears right now, especially on the revenue org side, is that people are going to just kind of willy-nilly lean into AI without a plan, and they're actually going to crush productivity of their revenue organization by throwing all sorts of new, unproven tools. And I'm not as worried about the unproven because a lot of this stuff is brand new. It's more that people are throwing all sorts of new tech at their team to do everything for them. And folks are just spending all their time learning and working with these tools, and they're not actually engaging with customers anymore. So we're doing the opposite, and we got to watch out for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I'm always quoting this study that I read from Battery Ventures, I think it was, that we can manage a pipeline that was managed so far with 125 people in sales. In, I don't know what they called it, like in 5 years, because of AI, we can probably manage them with 75 people. And I think the question that arises from this is that you need to find 33% efficiency somewhere in your organization to drive the same pipeline, because what that means usually is that the prices for the same stuff is also going to come down. Because if your competition can run their organization for that kind of price, then they will also reflect it in their prices to underbid you and so forth, specifically in a competitive market like the one that we have. And yeah, so we're going to talk about this today. So this is really cool, and I'm really looking forward to this. So can you briefly talk about what G2 does above the just, I guess, the superficial understanding of what people probably know about? And yeah, and then we're going to dive into another topic on this one. So just like really quickly, so what is the relevance of G2, and why does anyone care what other people say about products?
Yeah. So my most recent chief revenue officer role was at G2, and G2 is really the world's largest software marketplace. And I think what people get wrong is thinking that it's just a review website. It's actually a two-sided marketplace right now that is all about helping global buyers around the world to be able to discover, research, compare, and decide what software and increasingly what services to support that software that I should be buying for my business, right? And so this is really much more B2B oriented, but it's all about helping buyers make incredibly good, fast decisions about what they can use to drive their business forward. And the thing that they also get wrong is like they don't think of this as a marketplace where, my part of the organization at G2 when I was there was very much about consulting and advising all of the software and services companies, of which there's over 100,000 in the marketplace, on how do you really well engage with the 100 million plus buyers that are coming here? How do you drive consideration? How do you educate? How do you get to the point of them wanting to raise their hand and take a demo with you?
I think the most interesting thing about G2, or like its existence to me, is that I occasionally have conversations with people that say like, yeah, like PLG does not work in B2B, or like it's just a different thing and so forth. And while that is true,
Yeah.
still, as a small business owner, medium business owner, even enterprise, someone somewhere starts a search somewhere or takes the phone and calls someone else. And it's either because of something that they read on G2, for instance, like sites like G2, and then
Yep.
they ask like, hey, did you hear about this product? This is true. Or it's the other way around. Hey, I'm going to call Mike about this particular software that he said. And then Mike gives me a suggestion, and then I cross-check it with what's happening on G2 and so forth to see whether it actually fits with my needs. And I feel like this entire buyer journey, like of what's happening and whatnot and so forth, it's not that easy attributable anymore than it used to be. Or like maybe it has never been and we just fooled ourselves. But this is what G2 means for me, like specifically, like it's extremely important that you manage word of mouth and credibility in a system that cannot be manipulated in that sense. Yeah.
No, I agree. I think there's, you know, with the generations that are growing in influence in business environments, right? As the younger generations take control of more budget, more decision making, the way they operate, the way they think, the way they learn is very different. Like word of mouth absolutely still matters, but there's so much research that is going on behind the scenes in platforms like G2 to just discover what options are there, to build your own personal perspective before you then start talking to trusted peers and colleagues that you're working with on specific projects. And so in a product focused organization, as the maybe a product led founder of a company, obviously you got to care about your product, but holy cow, you have really got to pay attention to what people are saying out in public about you.
Yep. That it could not be more truer. And I think just before we got started to record, you mentioned something really interesting that I want to talk about now. Because most of the time we talk about managing this kind of word of mouth for acquisition, right? So, like, hey, what are people
Yeah.
talking about us in the market? How important is it for acquisition and so forth? But you mentioned something really interesting, and that is about churn. So, in
Mhm.
November 2022, I wrote one of my most successful articles, which was an altitude map where we talk about, like, so, usually you create an altitude map. You say, like, so here's revenue. Here are the contributing factors that we have from the product side that are going to contribute to this. And instead of revenue, I created this altitude map about churn. So, like, for instance, let's say we have a server outage. This is going to indirectly contribute to churn in some ways, right? Like if it gets too crazy and so forth. And you said something very, very similar that I'm not sure whether you did it with altitude maps, but let's dig into this. So you were talking about churn prediction as a measure. As a CRO, like, Mike, are you crazy? Aren't you supposed to bring in new customers? Why do you take care suddenly of churn in a company? And what is your role on this?
Yeah. So I think the fear of a recession and all that's been going on in the world that has massively impacted economies, it kind of smacked all of us in the face about how stable and valuable were our products. And one of the things that meaningfully pivoted for us, and I distinctly remember this, it was kind of June of 2022 for us when we felt something materially just changed, right? Like all of a sudden, there's now skepticism about signing the contract. And it was like, nah, just give me 3 more weeks. And it was like, oh, wait, this feels like the onset of COVID again, where there's just a lot of, I'm not sure, just give me a little bit more time. And so, we went a period of continuing to do what we had been doing, right? We were using our adoption score, which had a good correlation to whether or not customers renewed, but it wasn't as dialed in as we needed it to be to all the variables that went into a true customer health score. And so over time, we being the chief product officer, myself and others across the business at G2, it evolved from, the adoption score into a true churn model where we had analyzed 47 different variables across customer behavior, across external data sets, across our own first party data. We were testing a lot of different variables. And in those 47, there were about 14 that were highly correlated to whether or not we had a happy, engaged, very high likelihood, like the 97, 98% correlation to likelihood to renew. Right. And then from there, we knew, like, all right, if these are the 14 variables, when any of these variables are breaking down, now we've got an at-risk customer. And
Mhm.
so we tried to move from more of the, hey, are customers generating reviews within the G2 marketplace to be able to build their presence, to attract buyers to their profile to review their product. If they had buyer intent, like, are they plugged in with an integration? Are they using that buyer intent? And we moved from that very good directional, like, are you using the product, to like very deeply refined data around, like, how complete is your profile? Have you uploaded information recently? And it's like that then started to see deeper behaviors where we're like, ooh, we have to pay attention to a lot of these nuances and how they're using the platform, and in more depth of recency and triggers within product utilization that we weren't paying attention to in the go to market organization and the revenue organization specifically. And then once we saw they were so correlated, that became direct insights to push as next best actions to our CSMs and say, hey, you have a customer that we flagged is at risk. They're 6 months from renewal, but here's one thing that you should probably go educate them on. They're not doing X within my G2 right now, and they should be taking advantage of that. Go host a training call with them.
So when you talk about these, what was it, 17 or 14 signals, like, can you give an example of a very, very specific one where you would say, like, I mean, I think you mentioned they have filled out the profile and so forth, but this does
Yeah.
not, to my brain, it does not sound like something that is signaling engagement on the platform, but maybe it does. How did you come up with them in the first place?
Yeah. So profile completeness was to me, one of the big surprises. My LinkedIn days, like, that was a known thing. I was like, oh wow, like their membership profile, right? Your LinkedIn profile highly correlated to whether or not you're going to be an engaged member. Thus, for our marketing solutions business, are you going to show up often and be somebody we can serve ads to? So it was kind of something that I was mad that I didn't think of for too long. But the idea that if you are a user and a customer of G2, if you're not logging in on a regular basis, and if you're not putting the effort into completing your profile, which then directly reflects externally to the buyers that are coming to G2, then you're not actually building a strong enough brand that then generates more traffic and more consideration for your brand in G2. And so when we saw that the profile completeness actually had a very high correlation, it to us signaled like you got a customer that's kind of like half in the boat, half in the water. It's like, okay, you did the basics, but that's not going to make you look great publicly to the 50,000 brands that are looking at your specific software right now. You need to go deeper. You need to upload, demo videos. You need to upload white papers. You need to change your call to action to, make it more accessible for folks that want to engage with your brand, right? You have a standard, download link, create demos and stuff of that nature. And so like we went into much more advisory mode with them of like, this is what a great profile looks like. And here's how you update
Mm.
that within my G2. And that would get them from like, I've input 5 of the 30 variables we've asked you to do to get them to 15, 20, 25 plus over time. And then that level of engagement meant they were really clicking on all ways to build their brand, drive consideration, and ultimately, get opportunities for their sales organization.
That makes a lot of sense. Can we be very specific about this? So let's say we identify, I don't know, a high value account that is, I don't know, during your scoring model, they're somewhere in the middle, they're kind of a little bit suboptimal. How would someone in customer success or in sales now consume this information? Would they get a trigger in HubSpot that says, like, hey, the profile is not clear enough? Do you expect your salespeople to know SQL to also look how does this connection happen and how fast do you reach out? Do you have any tactical tips in this regard?
Yeah, I think there's definitely triggers that are very urgent, right? And so this is part of the nuance of what the team continues to work through is, one, yes, we wanted to deliver direct actionable requests to the CSM. But we also wanted to prioritize those because if you're a CSM that just, if you're working with a mid-market customer base, and let's just say you have 50 customers, if each of them has a signal, 50 signals being, thrown at you every single week is very difficult to manage. So we started, thinking about how do we do prioritization within here, which moves to the top of the list, like the most red signal possible. And so we looked at variables like, okay, well, when is their renewal? That's an important sign of like, hey, we got to make sure that everything is working really, really well because in 2 months they're making their decision. And if things are not working, if they're not engaged, unlikely to renew. So we started looking at different things within, when the renewal cycle is going to be, how big of an alert is this, right? Like, give you a hypothetical, but if they're 6 months past due on paying their outstanding invoice, that becomes a pretty urgent signal because they're very much leaning out and there may be something bigger at play. They may be struggling as a business. So there's a lot that we looked at to try and say, if you're getting served 20 alerts, what are the most important ones that help you prioritize and say, all right, number 1 through number 20? Start with 1, then get to 2, then get to 3. And of course, I wanted my CSMs to really have the creative freedom to like kind of know like, okay, well, actually number 5, I got to jump on that one. Or opportunistically, number 7, I'm meeting with that client tomorrow. So I'm going to bring this up in that call. Right. So that we didn't want them to be robots, but we did want to ensure we weren't inundating them with here's 20 alerts. All of them are the same. Take care of all of them immediately. And so we would prioritize the type of alerts, the urgency with which to get back to them so that, the team could prioritize their time and day very effectively to be able to ultimately help our customers.
I'm always interested in how sophisticated these systems are. And because in my ideal mind, you have like three different ways to kind of react on this, right? So, like you said, you described something that is more like a push notification system, like here's a specific
Yep.
signal that is being triggered. And for instance, you would see it in a Slack channel, customer so and so, this and this, right? And someone grabs it. This is
Yep.
how I would imagine this would be in the simplest form. Is this more or less correct?
Yeah, more or less correct, right? So there are definitely signals that we actually saw where we wanted like a relationship manager to be aware of it, right? Like
Mm,
I actually want a relationship manager to know if a customer is significantly past due on paying their bills. I don't want to just leave that to a CSM. Frankly, a CSM may not be in a position to have that conversation. They may not know who the bill to people are, all that stuff that the renewal managers worked on before. So we were looking at different paths of like, hey, I'm going to push certain alerts to directly to a relationship manager, and Slack may be an avenue for that. But for the CSMs, it was about what customer success software could we use that would be their daily interface, right? If the CRM and forecasting tool is where sales folks live every day, I need a corollary system for my CSMs to also see the holistic customer health score and the prioritized next best actions per customer that allow them to really reprioritize their day and their week to take on some of the bigger issues that are going on within their part of the business.
I really, really like this. I think one of the most sophisticated integrations that we managed to do is when a customer called on the inbound that we also had the data pop up on the screen, digestible in, I don't know what the threshold was, but like I think we called it the 5 second rule. You had to be able
Mhm.
to digest like what was going on in the most important system for these particular. This only makes sense, of course, if you have enterprise accounts, but I just wanted to make a very specific point to the people that are listening to this because you're probably a founder or a CEO or like someone in senior product management or whatever, if you want to make good friends with sales, if you give easy, digestible, simple triggers that really have an impact, that don't just send signals, it's exactly what you said, right? So, like, if you have 50 signals a week, people are starting to ignore it. Everybody's like, oh, yeah, it's kind of nice, right? Like, but you're not really knowing like where you're sending it. I'm a big fan if product is involved in building this exact system that you said, So, for instance, if you have intercom or whatever that you use towards the customer and so forth, whatever it is, I'm a really, really big fan in kind of bringing these usage metrics together and then building an internal tool, which frankly, quite early can make a lot of sense. So, you're building it yourself versus buying it from the outside because oftentimes the leverage that you can get at this particular scale is quite fast reach. I don't know how you see this, but like I feel like if you want to get ahead in product, you ally up with sales in this regard. And if
Yep.
you know how to do that, you're gonna have a great, great career ahead of you. That's how I did it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree. I would give one word of caution on the kind of build versus buy side, but I first 100% agree that as a product organization, that was, why our chief product officer was so highly involved and directly driving the development of the churn model was that
Mm,
we didn't see this as just something for the CS organization to solve,
mm,
right? Because that's actually the worst way for us to solve this. One, the worst way is not do anything about it. Second worst way is like just assume your CSMs are saviors and be like, no, they'll fix it. Just give them visibility and they'll go out there and solve all the problems. There's actually much more to it, right? One, there's a scale problem because your CSMs probably already have a full plate. And now you're adding even more to dos on there, but also to dos that have high urgency, right? And so that's very difficult for CSMs, right? Like their bandwidth becomes an issue, their quality of work slips in some instances, and definitely their mental health can be shot if they're just like constantly inundated with a never-ending list of to-dos. So that's important, but the other part of this is why product needs to be a huge part of this solution is that it shouldn't just be the CSMs. We wanted to, and the company is looking at, and what I will do in my next gig starting next week is like, think about how can product and how can marketing help be a part of this customer education process,
mhm.
right? This doesn't have to be a CSM getting on a call and relaying information. How do we build better prompts within the product environment itself so that this doesn't become an issue, right? I think LinkedIn, if you're a LinkedIn member and you've built out your profile recently, like, they do an amazing job at gamification. It's all about giving you like, oh, you should do this. You should do this next. You should do this. This is really well engineered customer experience that helps them get you highly engaged, get to kind of completeness of profile, which then leads to you're adding more connections, which then leads to a more robust customized feed. And then, of course, you coming back more frequently to the LinkedIn app, right? And so, like, every company thinking about like what role can product marketing and the revenue organization play in engaging those customers who are showing specific behaviors, you're going to be in a way better place. Now, my cautionary tale is, yeah, if you're a super early stage, you could build this probably yourself. At some point, two things are going to happen. It's going to become a distraction because that's not your core. Like, that's not what you're actually building to sell yourself. So, like, watch out for that. And two, like, there are folks that do this for a living. So don't try to, compete in their market. At some point, get ready to thoughtfully migrate over to an external system where, like in the customer success software, like, they live and breathe this every single day. At some point, it makes sense for you to buy and partner up with somebody who is just constantly innovating around this and learning from hundreds, if not thousands, of other customers like you.
I think I would give a word of caution on your word of caution in this regard. What I do agree with you, no, I do agree with you. Like, one of the things is that in the organizations where people work with me, I have a lot of responsibility on the individual product teams that they have their metrics under control. And what that means is they have to implement the triggers that measure specific behaviors of customers in the product. That means data
Yep.
is only as good as it actually measures the stuff that we think it measures. And I had it quite often with teams that are more junior, like, or they do not really have a tight grip on this, that the data is saying something, but we're not 100% sure. So any external tool is only as good as well as the accuracy of our data that we feed into it, of course. But I think this is quite exciting. I'm just going to add like one point to this. And I think we usually talk about growth teams, or like from the product growth perspective. So this is not sales growth. This is really like from product growth. Usually what we talk about is we have these teams that are focusing on onboarding, right? So like, hey, how do we move people easily through these onboarding flows that we have? First time registration, lowest pricing plans, freemium trial, and all that kind of stuff. What we now see, and I think this is also going a little bit more into your direction, I'm structuring this as also right now at GodPhoto, is a secondary growth team that is solely responsible to facilitate expansion revenue, but from the product. So it's not just like sales knows this already, right? Expansion revenue, it's an important thing. But now with product, we also need to think about this. Why is it important? Because if we start to separate onboarding into two things, it's not just like when you sign up, but also when you're ready to actually upgrade into additional value, just in the way that you also explained it, then you take this complexity of this additional value out of the initial onboarding and you make the overall experience actually much, much more simpler, which is very, very important for any horizontal business that serves more than just like one very specific ICP that understands your product anyways. Just wanted to make this point because I feel like this kind of expansion onboarding, like the later stage onboarding on this stuff, this is going to come huge, huge. And it deals exactly with what you said, like it's fighting churn as well.
Yeah. I mean, expansion is the best way to fight against churn, right? Not only are they not going to churn, but they see the benefit and the return on investment to invest even more, right? And then they create signals for you that help you find more customers that are in a similar place. And that was where, we really wanted to keep evolving the model to have, like a churn score, but also start creating signals of, as I mentioned before, like the positive ones. Like, this is a customer that's really highly adopted and getting, by our vantage point, very positive value. Now, CSMs help validate that. We kind of built that into our motion when we were doing business reviews with customers. Like, we would, especially during the bad economic times, like, ask deliberately, like, hey, if, it's 6 months into your 12-month contract, if the renewal were tomorrow, would you renew? Right? And that became another signal, right? If they said yes, if, it's like, great, now we know, like, here's what we have to accomplish for the next 6 months to keep delivering value. But we would also be looking for, those signals within there to what you guys are thinking about. If you're highly adopted across the whole platform, and to keep it in a G2 context, if you have an amazing review base, if you're getting tons of folks that are looking at you, comparing you against, your competitive set, if you're using buyer intent to drive your demand generation marketing campaigns, to prioritize your sales outreach efforts, like that's fantastic. As we see those signals and get that feedback, it does trigger one thing that we were working on and did do with product is like, hey, if you're that highly adopted, I want to create an environment where you could see what's the type of licensed content that you could be getting from us to add into that outbound motion, whether it's sales team presenting this in a direct conversation or marketing using it within landing pages, within email copy and other places. Because what we have seen is there's a positive ROI correlation. If you're engaging buyer intent audiences on G2, these are folks that are coming to G2 because they trust and believe in what they're hearing there to make a smart decision. If they're already trusting G2, then why not use that G2 third-party validated content in that direct conversation when you get them engaging with your marketing materials or in a direct meeting with you? And so we had tons of case studies that showed if you're doing these two in combination, you're going to drive a better ROI. We've seen it in faster deal cycles, higher ASPs and closes. Like, do this in combination and it's going to work really well. So kind of building that into some of the product experience became one of the things that product was testing is like, okay, let's give you a preview, right? They actually built a content generator that started to show like, hey, here's grayed out images of the type of licensed content you could have. And then they added in like more of a true PLG motion, added in the ability to buy a couple of those with a credit card. So it's not the full blown package that's an annualized contract, but it's like, all right, test it. Like you can see what you could have now for a low fee, use your credit card, buy it, test it. If it's working, then create what we always talked about as the product assisted growth, which I'm a big, big believer in. Product assisted growth is then I get a hand raiser. And I love that in sales. I got a customer coming back and saying, I want to learn more about your licensed content because we just tested out 3 of the different ad creatives that you guys had served up to us. It was 2x our normal engagement rate. We have, a better cost per lead coming in for that ad creative type. Like, I want to make this a part of my normal stream. What do you got for a package for me?
Exactly. What else have you got? Like what are the other drugs that you can give us? Let's go there for a second. So because I feel like this is exactly on right. So like I talk about PLG all day.
Yep.
So let's say we have someone listening to this and say like, hey, that sounds all fucking amazing. But first of all, either my sales leader he doesn't understand or I don't understand it, whatever. And we have a PLG organization. So let's just start from this. We start to have volume licensing questions. Hey, do you have 100 licenses at the same time and so forth? And I also do not want to, so I'm not experienced in sales. I do not know how do I get started with this, Mike? Like, who is my first hire? How do I kind of drive this to kind of get to an organization where sales, customer success, and product and marketing are fundamentally aligned on this kind of stuff? I talk a lot about the CPO portion of this. How do I get started with sales? Who is my first hire? Who should it be? And when should it happen?
Yeah. We can go into the when it should happen, but let me start with a little bit of premise setting first. Like first, I'm going to talk mainly from a B2B perspective in answering this, right? So B2C, a little bit different. Now, PLG, product-led growth, works when you really believe that a person or a company is basically going to do everything themselves. I'm going to come educate myself. I'm going to run a trial. I'm going to convert and pay on like a credit card, ostensibly, and I'm going to become a paying customer. That's great. That's the dream, right? Super efficient. Don't need those high-priced sales folks who don't know what they're talking about anyways. Well, the reality is that you got to know that there are parts of your audience that you want to and believe you can add tremendous value to who will not transact that way, right? So that's where product assisted growth comes in. And at G2, we debated this. It was a fantastic debate of like, hey, we've got to get more PLG motions coming in here because we're trying to create efficiency within our go-to-market engine. Plus, it's also a really good user experience because we have people that are asking for demos all the time. Why don't we just let them take that further on their own terms? But at the end of the day, we knew not everybody, and actually a large portion of our audience was not going to buy on their own. Product assisted growth became, what's the mission to have products helping educate and inform, and then creating hand raiser moments where I get a super warm lead. It's effectively as powerful as a demo request, right? Demo requests for us converted at phenomenal rates relative to like people showing up at webinars and whatnot.
No.
Product assisted growth became an awesome way to just drive more education in our customer base and have them raise a hand and be like the content example. This is working. I want to look at a whole annualized package. Okay, let's talk about it. But there were other motions that we had going as well. Now, when you get into that mode of saying, I'm starting to see signs that not everybody that I should be working with is willing to do this on their own. That's the start. Because it goes into your ICP. All of a sudden, you're going to start seeing firmographic, demographic, behavioral triggers that say, this is a different audience that I have to approach uniquely. If that audience is big, if they have enough revenue potential, then you should think about, how do I start creating a proactive outbound motion to go find, influence, and convert more of them to customers? That's when your outbound sales organization should start to exist, right? And that's like, you got to have the right opportunity and you got to have the right kind of signals to create an ICP. And then I look at the first hire and say, like, one, doesn't have to be a CRO, but you got to have somebody in sales, right? Could be a VP of sales, could be a director of sales, but you have to have somebody that comes into the sales organization who can do two great things for you. One is like, do the basics of sales. Set up your sales processes, your sales methodology, your forecasting, your pipeline and CRM and all that stuff, right? Like, be capable of doing the job of selling. But the second really important one is what you were alluding to before. If you're on the product side and you've always run PLG-led companies, like, you don't necessarily know what it takes to do great outbound. So you need that hire who's a leader of sales. They have to be capable of doing strategy. They have to be capable of helping you hone and perfect who is in the ICP that my team should be focusing on, that we should be lasering in on. And product, you can keep sourcing and winning a lot of amazing customers. But you know what? I'm going to actually start thinking about a two-layered strategy on my sales side. I have an ICP that allows me to go into this giant universe of prospects and say, out of the 10 million of you, here's the 20,000 that really matter to my outbound sales efforts to prospect. But separately, I overlay that ICP data on my customer base and say, hey, product, you're securing a lot of amazing customers via your channel that I think I can expand, right? They actually fit some of the criteria of who we would have gone after. That's great. You secured them. Now let me think about converting them into like a CSM supported model or assigning an account manager, a relationship manager to own expansion of that relationship. Right. And there, just to keep it super simple, it could be like, hey, we didn't think this was possible, but a 10,000 person company just signed up online to be using and testing our product. That's fantastic. I better get in there and make sure they're using it really well. I want to get in there, introduce myself, make myself accessible, run, executive briefings, make sure that they're using the, university content, webinar content, whatever you got to help educate themselves and be there to answer questions for them. Because that 10,000 person company who just bought, a $10,000 trial could be a 6-figure, 7-figure customer in the future for us if the whole business standardized on us.
I find this very fascinating because what you're describing is that we're looking beyond the classical kind of sales function, right? Like this is what everything that you just described is a little bit more also customer success, which is anyways quite close to sales anyways, right? Like specifically if you're an account executive and so forth. But you're also talking a little bit about product work here, right? Like so also when you talked about usage behavior and so forth. So I'm a big fan of also asking product teams and shocking them and just asking them, so like, hey, do you know how many Handraisers or like product or like sales calls that you have created over the last, I don't know, whatever time frame it is? And quite a few product teams can actually answer this. But then when you ask also like, so how many of these demo calls have already done something in the product? So like how many of these demos are
Yeah.
actually activated? This is what you were talking about. So it's not just like how many MQLs, how many SQLs, and all this garbage that you had. This is where product can really deliver a lot of value, and product managers need to do this. This is what they need to wake up to, right? It's like if you can deliver to someone, hey, this guy was in this part of the product and he did this particular action before you call, and that can be just a simple flag in HubSpot. You need to understand how these calls are being taken and so forth. There's a lot of value in there, and it doesn't have to be too complicated too, but I think this, it needs to happen from product because product owns this kind of data. And I really like this, right? So like you also need to give the structure to the sales leader that is coming in.
Yeah. I think if you hire your first head of sales, I would hope that you have a product leadership team who can do an amazing job articulating not just here's how awesome our product is and look at all these amazing features we have and everybody should be using them. It's like, no, take a step back from that. It's all about, at the end of the day, these folks are buying for a reason. There is an outcome that they're looking to drive, and there is an ROI behind that outcome that they expect to have. If the product team can articulate to that head of sales, here's who we sell to,
Mm-hmm.
here's the value they expect to us, and that's probably like a business outcome statement as well as an ROI kind of quantifiable number. It's like they want to increase their productivity, which is measured by X and Y. That's why they love us. That's what we deliver. Okay, now here's what they use in the product that delivers that outcome for them. Then you've got what you need, right? You need a purpose-built product to drive the ROI that the customer expects. That then allows marketing to build the narrative around it and say, this is why you should love us too. That then allows you as the head of sales to build sales enablement that trains everybody on that narrative, on that demo path within the product experience that they should be using, and then allows you to create really good defined territories, compensation plans, and all the other stuff that says, here's who we're going after, here's what we should be selling them, this is the value we're going to provide. Now let's go to it.
So this is very interesting because I also wanted to briefly touch on the compensation plans. But before we go there, I think you said something very interesting. So when we talk about ICPs, and this is an internal topic that I have constantly with everyone, everywhere. Usually companies are very afraid of defining real ICPs, right? Like to getting really narrow because they're afraid that they're giving away business and so forth. But then on the side, they see like, oh, but we should do the ICP definitions. Oh, then we should do the strategy. Oh, then we should do the compensation plans. Oh, then we should do this and then we should do that. In this entire kind of salad of things that you should do, if you define really good ICPs and doing them narrow, and let's talk about this for a second, but like let's say we just take out the biggest risk from our ICPs or like the biggest red flags in that sense. If you have good ICPs, everything else afterwards becomes also incredibly easier. Specifically, so for instance, let's say you're talking about compensation plans. If I know that a very specific ICP only lives in a very specific geography and has a very specific behavior, I can also structure my compensation plan sometimes in regards to this particular salesperson because they're probably also going to work on these particular ICPs and it works for them. And this is the thing that is quite difficult. So, like, how do we think about this? Like, what is a good ICP profile for you in 2024? Let's just maybe start there really quickly.
Yeah. One, I'll agree with your premise that companies, they don't want to feel like they're limiting their opportunity. So they'll stay too broad. But I think the other aspect of this is that most companies don't dig into their ICP enough to realize they're too broad. It's like, oh, I'm a great software that all marketers should be using. Like, let's go sell the marketing. It's like, do you know how marketing teams are structured? Do you know how that changes from a 50-person company to a 10,000-person company? Like, you're not really empowering your sales team or your marketing team to be very effective if your simple inspirational guidance is marketing loves us, go talk to marketing. So I would say, one, like, don't boil the ocean. Like, you don't have to get crazy defined, but you've got to check yourself on, am I being specific enough? I'll keep it relatively simple, but a tangible example. When I joined G2, we did an amazing job building relationships with like product marketing, customer marketing, right? Because the starting point most clients were at that point in G2's time was like building up my review base, building up my presence, building up my third party validated credibility, right? And so those were great entry points because product marketing and customer marketing were the ones that ultimately had owned most of the review generation strategy at that point. Made total sense. Still needed to have those relationships. So it wasn't like, hey, go talk to marketing. It was more defined of, here's the type of person in product marketing you should be talking to. Here's the type of person in customer marketing you should be talking to, all within only software companies and only companies that are actually listed in our marketplace. And so there were many variables that like helped remove a lot of the, oh, I'm just going to call this company, right? So we helped narrow it down. We got specific to a departmental level. Then you get to more of like a title level of, hey, it's also best to start at the kind of director level. And so all of that, where it kind of got very dialed in, but not, like not too crazy dialed in, that it was like, man, that doesn't feel like there's much of an ocean here. It feels like a tiny little pond of opportunity. And so it's good. The problem, not necessarily the problem, but the one opportunity that we took on as I joined is like, hey, we're also pigeonholing ourselves, because you know what? One of the greatest things that we have right now to help these software companies is our buyer intent. The product marketing team, the customer marketing team do not care about buyer intent.
Mm.
The demand generation team over there, they care about it. We've got to update our ICP, but specifically align our ICPs to the packages that we have and say, if we're talking about review generation, these are the personas within the marketing department for these type of companies in these geographies that we should be talking to. If you're talking about buyer intent, nope. You got to be talking to these departments, these personas within those departments, because that's who's going to utilize that data to really drive ROI for what they're being asked to do for their business. And so that is where, like, if you're not inspecting your ICP to understand at a, more of like 100-foot level, like, this is who my sales rep is actually going to get on the phone.
Yeah.
And who can credibly present, here's the value we're going to drive aligned to what you're being asked to do every single day. If you're not getting that granular, then you are flying too high, and it's a kind of hope and a prayer of like, just talk to the CMO. It's like, CMO may not care.
Yeah, and CMO, I mean, yeah, you have CMOs in 4-people companies, right? So like, I mean, it doesn't mean anything anymore. Like, you need to be a little bit more specific than this. That's true. So really quickly, because we did not touch on it at all as well. So I have a very specific opinion on compensation plans when we talk about sales, and also like we talked about like when to hire a first sales leader. We did not talk about this specifically. So like, when should you hire the first salesperson? I generally still think that the founders should stay the most senior salesperson, at least with the amount of contact that they have to the customer base, for as long as possible. If you do not enjoy it, sure, of course, at some point you need to have a sales leader in your company. But I think the more interesting bit is like, so how do we structure a sales compensation for beginners?
Yep.
Like, how do I approach this so I'm not going to get completely fleeced? Because I have the impression that you should not reward sales too early, because otherwise you turn your company very quickly into an agency for one big enterprise client that is going to dictate your entire product backlog. Do you have any opinion on this? I know you know mine, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do love your perspective on, staying founder led on the sales side. It's really important. I mean, even if you are a product led founder, being in front of prospects and customers will only refine your perspective on how the product has to be built to deliver value. So there's that obvious benefit, but it really does help you hone your ICP and get to a level of product market fit where you can be really good and very direct with whomever you bring in to lead your sales organization about who your ICP is, how many of those folks are out there, and what your growth expectations are, selling into that audience. Because your other point that you had made in prior conversations is on point as well. Is like compensation plans dictate where sales folks spend their time. Right? Like that's just the obvious thing, or else you shouldn't be in sales. If you're not thinking about my comp plan structured in this way, these are the behaviors I should be doing to drive what's going to make me the money, right? And so you got to be really mindful. You bring in the head of sales at a point when you know that they are in a place that they can bring in good deals, not like anybody that then crushes your product organization to like solve everybody's needs in the world. And many of those problems shouldn't be solved.
So what is a good deal?
Well, if you know your ICP, like if you have a granularity on that, then that's a starting point of like, all right, I know these are the folks that we believe and or have a lot of evidence because we're now, maybe a $4 or $5 million revenue stream. Like these are the folks that have stayed with us for 2, 3, 4 years. We have great product market fit here. We also know these are the companies and customer types that churn regularly. We are absolutely staying away from that. And so again, keeping things simple, hey, let's not focus on this industry because they just don't get us. They think we're great. They want to date, but then it's like, nope, not commitment material, and they drop us. And we put a ton of energy into it. And to your point, we're going to pay a bunch of AEs to land these logos that only just churn after first year. So you land, you really get good on the ICP, super helpful. You bring somebody in that can think about the sales stuff, but the strategy stuff as well. Then they've got to really build a compensation plan that rewards the right behaviors. I think on the acquisition side, when you're winning new logos, there's a short-term thing where you use the ICP to guide like literally what companies are you putting in their book of business that they're even eligible to sell to and get credit for, right? That helps, right? Because you can kind of eliminate some of the potential for bad deals by not giving them the opportunity. And I think this is a pitfall of too many early stage companies where it's just like, hey, if they're not in our CRM right now, and you find a company and you want to call them, great, just add them in. They're part of your book. You know how much time your AEs spend just literally building a database of companies that they think they should call into? And many of them are outside of your ICP and a total waste of their time. And they're going to spend a crap load of time. They're going to close some deals. They're going to feel good about them. And those deals are going to churn. So like help them focus on the right companies in the short term. And then you do have to be thinking long-term in acquisition plans. Some of this is, if you're an earlier stage company, you got to be thinking about levers within comp plans that do look at what are the ramifications of you selling bad deals. And there's some like softer things you can do, and there's some sticks you can put into a comp plan. Softer things you can do that I highly recommend everybody does. Again, at G2, we built a mutual success plan. That was like at its core 5 questions that needed to be answered by an AE before a deal could close. Right. So all of your new logo pipeline, they had to have an MSP, and the frontline manager would inspect those MSPs, would ask questions about it in their one-on-one conversations and their forecasting calls. And those questions and the answers within those questions helped us kind of weed out bad deals.
So what were those questions? Like, is it a part of our ICP, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So like one of them, I'm very ROI focused. So like one of them was, what is the actual ROI they expect from G2 for the package they're buying? And a red flag for us is if a manager looked in that MSP as a deal was going through the process and being qualified and all that, if they're like, they want guaranteed leads, they want 1,000 leads from us this year. It's like, whoa, warning. Like, hey, that's not the way our marketplace works. We're not a guaranteed lead gen provider. We're not that company you call and say, I just want 500 leads at $75 per lead.
No.
Go find them for me. That's not what we do. So it's a red flag. Sorry, you got to requalify. If that's their definition of ROI, then we should not close this deal. We either refine that with them to get them on something that does align to what we can deliver, or close this deal as lost, focus on somebody else. Right, so that's more of a soft one where you build that culturally into the DNA of the team. Like, hey, there's a part of our sales process. There's a vetting here. if the manager's not being disciplined about this, then the second line leader, the head of sales, like, you have ways to get involved to like keep everybody honest. As the head of sales, it matters because if you have a churn problem on the back end, you could be doing great on new logo, but you're missing, your targets on the customer business. So like, you want to make sure there's that soft gate. The other thing is it shows up very poorly in performance reviews. Like we would track what is the kind of lifetime value of customers. And if we started seeing like, oh man, in quota council, this one AE keeps being brought up as closing a bad deal, that a relationship manager now says like, I can't be accountable for this. They sold this based on us guaranteeing them 500 leads, and we don't do that.
Yeah.
It's like I'm in a no-win. I'm trying to multi-thread. I'm trying to build new stakeholders and diversify the way they're thinking about us. But like that's what they're dead set on. This account's going to churn. It's like if you see that, like an AE who comes up in that way via our tracking or the kind of qualitative discussions we have in quota councils and stuff, it's going to be a bad performance review. Now, just the stick is like you actually put it into the comp plan itself, right? If you sell a bad deal and we can prove you sold a bad deal, then there's a clawback process. And we actually debook that revenue from your historic and we claw back what we paid you in commissions. Now, that should not be done a ton. That should be a rarity, but it is something that is in the back of the team's mind is like, okay, I could take this down, but they may actually come back looking for this, $700 in commissions in the future because the customer is likely to churn.
So while I agree with clawbacks in general, right? So like, hey, if the deal doesn't come through, then you're going to pay back the money and so forth. I'm never 100% sure how much that it actually changes on the acquisition behavior of a salesperson. I do think it has an impact. Don't get me wrong. What I was thinking about is also like, so this is all retroactive. Like, so let's see how much money comes in on the LTV and so forth. All of this makes a lot of sense. 100% with you. There is an interesting thing because I'm considering writing a compensation plan from like this product focused, like, hey, PLG, like how do you get started kind of position. And one of the issues that I was thinking about is like, how can we incentivize actions that we know correlate to longer term revenue behavior also from the customer, but that do not directly generate revenue? For instance, what I usually want to avoid is that as soon as someone has signed on the dotted line, that they are just completely abandoned, right? And then they talk to someone else. Yep. So I want to have some kind of transition period so they're not completely left alone, and that sales is also responsible for onboarding them a little bit. Do you know what I mean? So there are some concepts out there on how we can structure this. I don't know whether you have any idea on this, but there are things where we cannot measure the revenue directly, but we do know that they're positively correlated. It usually means that sales has to do a little bit more of what customer success is doing by themselves.
Yeah, and this does depend on, where are you at as a company? Like if a customer success organization does not exist, then it's much easier to write some of this into, an AE's job description, right? It's to your point, it may not be the tried and true commission plan. They may actually have a more of a bonus plan oriented where it's like partly you have a target, you got to hit that target to get this part of your bonus. But then you also have OKRs, other business performance metrics that you have to hit. And that could be things like, their time to activation. It could be things about adoption. Like, absolutely, you could do that. If you're in a world where you do have a CSM organization, then it's more, that's where the trick comes in of like, well, the AEs basically separate themselves, right? Because their job, build new logo pipeline, qualify it, close it, hand it off, move on, right? And there's a value to a sales org having that dedicated focus and that skill set who's just like so good at that part of the customer journey. And then you hand it to a CSM, and that's where the CSM's compensation plan would pick up. Like we use adoption score. That was one of the things that our CSMs was weighed on whether or not they made their bonus. Are they in the green or not?
Did they fill out the profile?
Yep. Are they in the green on the adoption score? We did that, evolve that into them being on like GRR, gross retention, and net retention, right? And so it's like, hey, adoption score is directionally correlated, but we do want you really thinking about and doing things beyond what the adoption score asks. And this is before we built the churn score. But it's like, hey, you should be a part of, building senior level relationships to ensure that the ultimate budget owner knows the value that we're delivering. Right. And so those became things that it's like, technically that's not in the adoption score, but you should be doing these. That leads to a renewal, that leads to expansion potential. And so we've played around with a lot of different options over the years. We, myself, my leadership teams and others, to just like make sure we're driving the right behaviors, and comp is that starting point lever.
And I think it always comes down to, do you find the incentives that are easy to measure and easy to understand as well? This is an art by itself, because you do not want to have these meetings where the CEO just stands in front of the company and says, like, guys, you need to take better care of the customers. It's usually a CEO problem already, or a revenue leader, or whatever it is. So, Mike, I don't want to take more of your time. I think this was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for staying this long with me. Do you want people to get in contact with you? If so, how should they do it? Should they badger you on LinkedIn? How can people talk to you?
Yeah, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me a connection request, send me an email after that. I'm happy to answer follow-up questions and help however possible.
That sounds amazing. And congratulations to our new gig. When this episode is coming out, we probably know where it is. So all the best to you. Thank you so much for being on the product team.
Thank you so much.
Baboom. That's it. Thank you so much for listening to The Product Tea with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.